From London, this is the Standard Podcast, and I'm Mark Blunden. Coming up,
even those community members that sometimes don't have much are willing to donate whatever little they have to ensure that people that don't have anything have something.
Los Angeles wildfires, how a tenants' union is helping Angelenos survive the aftermath. But first, the Israeli Security Cabinet has ratified an initial 6-week deal with Hamas for a ceasefire in the war that will see the release of some of the hostages still being held in Gaza. The breakthrough will mark a cessation in 15 months of fighting since the Hamas terror attacks in Israel on the 7th of October 2023, and now brings hope of border crossings being reopened for aid to ease the Palestinian humanitarian crisis. The US brokered ceasefire, which will see an exchange for Palestinian prisoners held in Israeli jails, will also come a day before President-elect Donald Trump's inauguration. Now, the Standard Podcast is joined by Dr Rob Geist Pinfold, a lecturer in international security in the Defence Studies Department at King's College London. It's been a fast-moving few days, certainly that we've heard about in public. What do we know about the current situation as it stands with the ceasefire deal regarding the hostage release, the prisoner swap? What has been agreed and what detail is still to be hashed out?
Well, the long and short of it is that both sides agreed not to agree for the time being, and they agreed on a long-term 3-stage process. The first stage of that process is the ceasefire in Gaza coming into effect. Israeli Defense Force troops will withdraw from large parts of Gaza. Now, they won't leave all of Gaza. They will retreat to a 1-kilometer buffer zone around Gaza's borders. So I think it's important to note that they won't be leaving entirely. That was Hamas's demand, but they compromised on that. And what will happen from Hamas's side is that they will begin to release some of the approximately 100 hostages they still hold. But Israel wanted all of the hostages released for an end to war, whereas Hamas have managed to secure, for the time being, Israel's compromise that only a few of the hostages will be released, and there will be 33 of them released in this first stage, which will go on for around a month and a half before we get into the second stage. And in return, Israel will release around 1,000 Palestinian prisoners, some of whom have been captured during the current war, some of whom have been in Israeli jails for a very, very long time, some of whom also are serving life sentences for things like murder and terrorism. So this will cause a bit of a kickback in Israel, I think it's fair to say.
In terms of the American involvement, now both the Biden and Trump camps, obviously days before his inauguration, claiming influence on this deal. What do we know about the American involvement as a broker, these Qatar meetings?
This was Biden's deal, but Trump delivered it. Now, the deal has actually had a lot of pushback in Israel from hostage families who said, look, this is exactly the same deal that Biden put on the table midway through 2024, and Israel rejected it time and time and time again. Why are they suddenly agreeing to it now? Why did so many soldiers have to die? Why did so many hostages have to die before you got to this point? That's what they're saying to Prime Minister Netanyahu. But I think it's no coincidence that the ceasefire will come into effect on Sunday and Donald Trump will be inaugurated as president into his second term on Monday. This is clearly Israel trying to give Trump a gift. Netanyahu is hoping that if he bends now and gives Trump concessions, Trump will then give Israel concessions in return in the longer term. Stuff like, for example, peace relations and normalization with Saudi Arabia, possibly moves to increase settlement building in the West Bank. So there are enduring questions as to what extent a Gaza ceasefire might deliver the West Bank on a silver platter to Israel. Indeed, one of the reasons why it took so long and there was some sort of tentative worries that a deal would break down is because Netanyahu was delaying the vote in his cabinet to give far right-wing settler parties more inducements to stay in government. Things like West Bank settlement building. So that's one of the fears going forward. And I think you're right to mention Qatar, because Qatar is the big winner out of all of this, actually. So remember, Qatar is a very, very small Gulf country. It's dwarfed by Saudi Arabia. It's got Iran next to it. It's had frosty relations with both. And it's trying to position itself as a kind of Switzerland of the Middle East, being open for negotiations and mediation between any and all parties. Don't forget, it's also hosted talks with the Taliban in the past, which led to the US's withdrawal from Afghanistan. So Qatar here has really managed to project its power and its influence.
What now for the humanitarian crisis in Gaza? Do you think we can see more of the crossings being opened, more help being let in?
We will definitely see the crossings being opened, and we will definitely see more help being let in. The Egyptians have said they're already preparing for this. The Gulf states are preparing to send aid. But the question is, will they live up to their promises? We've had various rounds of conflict between Israel and Gaza's Hamas rulers in the past. And there's always all sorts of high and mighty talk about rebuilding Gaza, creating the Singapore of the Middle East on the Mediterranean and what have you. Yes, some money does come in, but a lot of this money doesn't come in. A lot of the promised funds don't materialize, and many of the funds that are channeled by Hamas into building, for example, tunnels or rockets. So that's something that the international community fears will happen again. So there has to be a real concerted effort to rebuild Gaza. The question is will, I think, because obviously Israel won't foot the bill for it. The US will be unwilling to foot the bill for it, given the Trump administration's whole raison d'etre is pulling back the US commitments worldwide. Other countries in the region, it's fair to say they're not that developed enough to finance the wholesale restructuring and rebuilding of Gaza. And then you have the Gulf states who at the moment are prioritizing rebuilding Syria because they have particularly strong relations with the new government under Ahmed al-Shara. So Gazans will be struggling to attract the money they need, and not just money, by the way, also things like political support, security sector reform, and questions of a day after. The big open question is who will rule Gaza once the ceasefire ends.